Hey, beautiful people. So, I am still on the Darriynn Brown situation currently, and I don't accept it. DNA my ass. Excuse me. I'm sorry if the kids are listening. DNA my butt. Okay. I don't buy it. DNA, including blood, has been, can be planted. Please, let's not act like we live in a world that is so righteous, where people don't frame people, where cops don't frame people. And let's please remember the source of all this information, where it all started. Possible trap house, definite drug heads living in the house. You've seen the records. I showed you myself. So I'm not just saying she looks and sounds like a drug head. I'm telling you, this woman has a long, lengthy history, as does Cash's father, as does a few more people on the Sherrod side of the family. So let's put all that together and then we'll get back to the fact. DNA can be planted. The young man lived there for 10 months. We all know this now. He literally walked into the house on videotape. We saw that in the morning. I'm not talking about the in the white suit. I'm talking about the next morning when he was talking to Cameron. He walked in, he reached down, he rubbed the baby's head. Of course his DNA is in there. It's probably all over the place. So yeah, I'm sure it was on the clothes. Not to mention, let's think about this. The clothes were not on the baby. He had no shirt and no shoes, they said. So to take those clothes off and then to mix them somewhere where Darren's DNA had been, not hard. All you needed was something he touched or worn. The proof is in the pudding. It's happened before. This would not be the first time. So I don't understand why everybody's acting so. I don't have a word that's not nice. So I'm not going to say it. And it's not everybody. Figure of speech. A lot of people, and I don't know what the bias is, or maybe they really look at the video and they really see Darriynn. Maybe they do. But I don't get it. And I don't care what color you are. I don't care what gender you are. None of that matters to me when it comes to right and wrong, period, ever. So I don't feel this way because this is a black man that's going down. There was a white man that went through something. There was a couple of them that went through this, but definitely remember Making a Murderer on Netflix? It happens. I said before, it's more of economic status than racial. But let's not act like this type of thing doesn't happen. That's my point. Don't get brand new. Oh, DNA, they got DNA in the story. Are you freaking kidding me? Really? End of story. Sounds like some very entitled people or sheltered people. But you got to wake up before it's your child or your husband or you. I just want to show this down here. This is an awesome article. There's the address in the address bar. But I'm going to show a couple of things to back up my rant that I just went through. Okay. I feel how I feel. And I don't sugarcoat it. I try to always be politically correct when I say things, but I'm going to say what I feel. And it's not an emotional rant. It's based on life and experiences and facts. So let me find the section that I really wanted to read from here. Was it one more? Couldn't have been. All right, bear with me, guys. 1 second. Okay. I had it. Oh, there it is. Right there. Just this little part I'm going to read. But again, this is an awesome article. A lot of facts. Since the mid 1990s, the Innocence Project, a nonprofit legal organization based in New York City, has analyzed or reanalyzed available DNA to examine convictions, winning nearly 200 exonerations and spurring calls for and reform of the criminal justice system. Nearly 200 exonerations, y'all. I mean, it happens. I'll just leave it at that. Now, I have a video here that I wanted to share from PBS. And just open your mind and just go here.
Imagine this. Two cops come to your door and arrest you for murder. You know you didn't do the crime. In fact, you were in the hospital at the time the cops say the murder was committed, and you have records to prove it. But the cops have evidence too. Your DNA. It was found on the dead man's finger. How could that have possibly happened? I've been looking into DNA and whether it's as reliable as we all think it is. We all have a lot of faith in DNA, and it is pretty conclusive. It's better than any other forensic science we have, especially when you have a large amount of one person's well-preserved DNA. To interpret DNA, analysts look at a chart called an electrophoregram. A perfect sample of DNA comes out like this. But in criminal investigations, finding a perfect sample is actually not the norm. Sometimes analysts are working with degraded samples that are old or have been exposed to the elements. See how the spikes start to fade away? Or they're interpreting a sample with many people's DNA, and all the spikes combined together. It can be hard to tell whose DNA is whose. Sometimes they're working with tiny amounts of DNA, maybe a piece of evidence the suspect touched. In these cases, the spikes can be small and difficult to interpret. Some labs won't even analyze these samples, but some will, even though the margin of error is higher. Technological advances will probably solve some of these problems and make DNA analysis more accurate. But as technology advances, it will also introduce new problems. Someday soon, analysts may be able to detect the genes from a single cell, and we leave our cells everywhere we go. Those cells can travel to places we've never even been. So it's not impossible that your DNA could be found at a crime scene and cops could knock at your door. That's what happened in 2012 to a man named Lucas Anderson. He was in the hospital at the time of the murder. It turns out that the paramedics used the same oxygen monitor on his finger that they used on the murder victim's finger later that day. And that's how Lucas's DNA was transferred to the murder victim's fingernail. Lucas Anderson was in jail for 5 months before they figured out what had happened.
So, it happens. Doesn't seem very hard either. So, no, my mind hasn't changed not one single solitary bit. Not at all. As a matter of fact, it only made me want to educate and be sure that we all know it doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not the end. With everything going on,
never met.
Let's back this up.
Forensic scientists has helped law enforcement solve many crimes which otherwise would have remained a mystery. But as technology advances for collecting DNA samples at crime scene, so does the possibility of error. Experts in the field say that your DNA can be collected from a crime scene you've never even been at. And in the case of Lucas Anderson, it led to murder charges. Joining me to talk about this is RT correspondent Brigitte Santos. Brigitte, let's talk about the case of Lucas Anderson. How did his own DNA frame him for murder?
In 2012, a homeless alcoholic man named Lucas Anderson was charged with first-degree murder when his DNA was found on the body of a murder victim who had been killed in a home invasion. Now, his DNA was specifically on the murder victim's fingernails. And the way that they got there was through a process called secondary transfer. All that means is that as humans, we leave our cells everywhere we go. In fact, we shed about 50 million skin cells per day. And those cells, our DNA, can then get picked up and moved around by a third party. So that's all that means. It turns out that on the night of this murder, Lucas Anderson had been passed out drunk in a hospital. Now, he could not remember where he was that night, so police, when they asked him about his whereabouts, he said he had no recollection. He also had a previous history and one conviction for a home invasion, and that's how this man was murdered. So it did not look good for him, but his lawyer did retrace his steps, and she was able to find out that he was actually innocent of this crime and that he had never met the murder victim or even ever been to the crime scene.
So, Brigitte, what led investigators to question the DNA evidence that implicated Anderson in that crime? What was it about?
Anderson's public defender, as she was building his defense, came across some files, including his medical records. And they proved that on that night when the murder was taking place, he was in the hospital. Now, experts believe that his DNA, Anderson's DNA, made its way onto the victim's fingernails through some of the paramedics' equipment, most likely through a finger oxygen reader that they had used on Anderson and then later on used on the victim.
It was an Australian forensic scientist who first revealed that DNA could be collected from fingerprints, but he also cautioned everybody that you could collect DNA from items a person never touched. Who was this scientist and how did he prove that? What's the significance of that?
The forensic scientist's name is Roland Van Oerschaut, and he discovered this process of secondary transfer back in 1997 after conducting a series of experiments. Now, in the experiment, he placed a jug of juice on a table. It had been sterilized previously, and he had a group of participants sitting around a table, each with their own glass to put the juice in, and all of those glasses were sterilized ahead of time. And what he found after swabbing everybody's glasses and the jug and their hands was that 1/3 of participants had the DNA of other participants on their hands. Now, none of these people touched each other during the experiment or previous to the experiment. And he also found that 1/3 of the juice glasses had the DNA of participants who had never touched some of the glasses. So everyone had their own glass, and people's DNA were showing up on each other's glasses, even though they had never touched each other's glasses. They also found foreign DNA on glasses, on the chairs, on the table, from people who had nothing to do with the experiment. And because they had set the controls and sterilized everything beforehand, they realized that that DNA had been brought into the experiment by those participants through secondary transfer.
One of the concerns that come up with this topic is the Rapid DNA Act of 2017. What does this law do, and why is it concerning in so many levels?
The Rapid DNA Act allows law enforcement departments to now use rapid DNA testing technology, which will allow them to find a match if somebody's already in the system in about 90 minutes. Now, this is a process that normally used to take days, so this can speed it up very, very quickly. Privacy advocates worry that this is going to increase invasive biometric collection with things like stop and spit policing, where cops ask anybody they pull over to give them a sample of their DNA through their saliva.
And this is something that has already been happening in places like Florida and in Connecticut, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And because DNA is not infallible, as we have seen with this Anderson case, privacy advocates worry that it's going to cause a lot more people to be implicated in crimes that they may not have had anything to do with.
The case of David Butler is another example of how DNA is believed to have convicted an innocent man of murder. Could you talk about that case just a little bit?
Back in 2011, David Butler, a cab driver, was charged with murder because his DNA was found on the victim's body, a woman. Now, he had a skin condition that caused him to shed excessively. And in fact, in the community where he drove those cabs, other cab drivers gave him the nickname Flaky because his skin was always flaking off. Now, he says that he had never met the victim, and his lawyer argued that it was very possible that he may have actually given a ride in his cab to the actual murderer, and that's how his DNA could have ended up on the victim's body. Now, in this case, it was enough to get his sentence thrown out, so he was able to go free. And that is also what happened in the case of Lucas Anderson when their lawyers brought up the issue of secondary transfer.
Scientists say that transferring of DNA is a phenomenon that has not been properly studied. And as far as you can tell, is law enforcement aware of this? And what are the investigators in Anderson's case saying after their experience?
It's unclear whether law enforcement agencies are aware of the issue of secondary transfer. I do know that in the United States, there are very few labs that actually study the phenomenon of secondary transfer, but it is indeed a very real process, and it's something that's only now starting to be acknowledged. And it is the backbone, DNA. DNA is the backbone of so many convictions, and it's very likely that other innocent people have been convicted for crimes that they didn't commit. But it can also now be used as a defense by guilty people who may have committed crimes. If their DNA does get onto the body of someone, they can now say that it was secondary transfer. So while it might clear up cases for some people, it could actually complicate others.
Wow. So, yeah, it could be used for good or evil. But it could be used. That's the thing. I have another video about Lucas that I'll share separately because I have to pull it up and everything, and I just wanted to point out, just because they say they have someone's DNA doesn't mean that's the guilty party. It still definitely doesn't mean he did it all by himself. But if the system wants it to point that way, it will. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion. This is mine, and it has not changed.